this episode is going to be called Before We Get to the... You don't need to have a criminal trial of witnesses or anything to just say, this is how it came into the country. He has the record, and it was for a completely innocent purpose. What a funny situation we're in.
But impeachment says you can't wait necessarily 5 years before getting rid of someone who is guilty of serious misconduct or is no longer capable of being president.
Is this living in willful ignorance when the country is crumbling better than actually reckoning with the true state of the ANC?
I like our constitution a little bit more than you do.
I like it a lot right now. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. As we are on the road to 35,000 subscribers, who better to join us for an in-depth conversation on all that's happening around President Cyril Ramaphosa's situation than journalist, broadcaster, public intellectual,
it's a good question.
Twitter.
It's a good question. I think journalist is like the word lawyer. Yeah. Do you use it as an all-encompassing noun for everyone in the industry?
Yeah.
Or do you think you must be a reporter to qualify to be a journalist?
Yeah.
So I'm never sure. I think broadcaster is probably the safest.
Fair enough. Yeah, I actually also don't like the label because I feel like what we do is kind of different to just pure reporting.
Absolutely.
But Eusebius McKaiser, thank you so much for joining us.
It's only a pleasure. I just hope that this conversation is not irrelevant by the time folks are viewing it.
Indeed, we shall make sure, because we don't know whether the president is going to resign, whether he will have resigned by the time people are watching this, or whether he won't have. But do you think he should?
I think he should. And I was pleasantly surprised by your definitive judgment that he should resign and your argument for it in the Mail and Guardian, because I think we shy away from clarity in our commentary and we like being discursive and to do, which as a trained debater I hate, unless the situation demands it. We do that sort of on the one hand, on the other hand type of approach to discourse. But if there is a clear case for why someone should fall on their sword, I don't think it gets much clearer than this. And the only reason why I even had a grammatical pause is that I was going to give you the cop-out answer, which I think in this case would also be okay, which is to say a convincing case for resignation can be made. And I suppose the only reason I might have framed it like that is because, as no doubt we're going to discuss, a question can be asked, should he take into account what would happen if he resigns? And if we think that might lead, in terms of consequences, to a worse scenario than the status quo, how should that factor into him considering whether to resign or not?
It's a really interesting point. I actually cannot wait for this conversation, by the way, because I've been also just wanting to find like extended commentary and reflection and analysis on this moment, and it feels like everything is just so quick and we're not delving deeply into all that this represents. And the first thing you say there is that we're set up some philosophical terms that people say you should never use on media just came to mind. Between this deontological versus consequentialist logic, right?
Yeah.
But I trust my audience.
Yes.
And effectively, there's a question of principle and whether we say, well, this is so bad that no matter what the consequences are, we have to set a precedent and we have to stand by principle here.
Yes.
And then there's a question of what will the consequences be? So, okay, yes, there's a principle, but what if the nation plunges into crisis or whatever? And it's interesting to watch those two discourses play out in the way that this resignation is being spoken about.
I think that's very true, and I think it's actually great that we just deep dive into that immediately. And it plays out in the public space in all sorts of ways. A doctor friend of mine was saying on my Facebook page last night, yeah, I kind of get you. There's a case for him to resign. But you know what? Better the devil you know. And I was very angry with him. And I said, no, Ismail, no.
Yeah.
And I had in mind a conversation you and I had earlier in the day on WhatsApp, that one of the bad things that will happen if it does not resign is that you set a certain precedent that is not a good precedent to set from a democratic theory point of view, i.e. that when the person that is entrusted to be the most important role model of a commitment to rule of law and constitutional supremacy is found wanting, and their action and inaction is not consistent with a deep commitment to constitutionalism, then if they are kept on in that role or do not recognize that it's important to cliff themselves politically, then in future, when you have someone who is less likable, more destructive, then you can't demand their resignation because you've set a precedent where apparently it's okay to be found wanting on the law and on ethical principles. And so there you've got a case for a combination of the two, because on the one hand you're saying, no, as a matter of principle, respect the foundations of democracy and constitutionalism, so you should resign. But actually also, you know, beyond undergraduate distinctions, it's not a choice between principle and consequences, because you can also say the consequences down the line will be poor for the country if you don't show a consistent commitment to principle.
Absolutely.
And I think people miss that. And they miss it for another reason that we can immediately throw into the mix, which is if your fave is in trouble, you lower your standards. I keep saying to people, as an exercise, ask yourself, how would you feel about the preliminary findings, even though they're labeled preliminary, which we'll come back to, as if that means not serious, which isn't the case. But how would you feel if this was former President Jacob Zuma? The same Ismail and many other people like him would say the least this guy can do is to resign. That's not the response you get in relation to President Cyril Ramaphosa, because he benefits from a certain kind of privilege. And we often talk about white privilege, we talk about male privilege, but privilege comes in many forms. And one of the privileges that President Ramaphosa enjoys is what I call likability privilege. And so I think the way we reason about how we should respond to this panel is, for some people, also motivated by the fact that they like this guy.
That's so true, and I think what you say is really important, because there's basically a deeper debate going on right now about the consequences for the country, and the consequences are not just limited to the short-term consequences, as you say. I think a lot of people who are on the side that, well, let's just keep him on, are looking at the short-term consequences. The rand may depreciate.
What will DD do?
Exactly. DD may become president. But then there's the question of what are the long-term consequences of setting this precedent? What are the consequences that stretch into the decades or many, many presidencies in advance? And for me, that case seems much stronger, or transcends the short-term pain. I'm prepared, and I think it's probably disingenuous to say there won't be negative short-term consequences.
For sure. Yeah.
There may well be.
Yeah.
But the question is, are we going to privilege short-term stability over setting a very dangerous long-term precedent that presidents can do things which seem impeachable, but if we like them, then they can basically do whatever they want.
Sizwe, I think that's right. I think we also need to take one step back, right? Because there's overlapping, shared background stuff in this conversation that I think not everyone, I think a lot of your viewers would share it, but we've got to make it explicit for the dispassionate viewer that may not be sure whether assumptions in our conversation so far are true or not. So let's lift them to the surface. The truth of the matter is that South Africa currently is in a massive crisis under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa. So when we talk about short-term pain, we must not pretend as if the status quo is painless.
Yes.
Which is why even a book such as Jacques Pauw's latest book, is critically important. And as I said in my review of that book, the least interesting part is the excerpts around the EFF and the titillating stuff about them having parties, etc.
Sure.
The part of that book for me that is the most interesting, which is everything that comes before the EFF, which only happens at page 350, is that he reminds us how President Cyril Ramaphosa has kept the president's keepers.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we mean President Jacob Zuma's keepers. So instead of showing, for example, that he has the leadership mettle to get rid of people who are corrupt, who have been found wanting, like Arthur Fraser, or an intelligence minister like Siyabonga Cwele, you find that suddenly they become ambassadors, or they become a DG in correctional services, or they get rearranged within the NPA, within the Hawks, within the SAPs. And lo and behold, if you look into the details, you will find some dodgy former cop is still dodgy in eThekwini, and his entire family has overnight, and I couldn't believe these are real examples, has suddenly been employed as lieutenants, as generals, what, and they're actually just sitting at home and getting passive income from the state, right? And on top of that, as you know, we're in a situation where the economy is not growing. Millions of black South Africans don't have a stake in either the democracy or in the economy. And you have a situation where under President Ramaphosa's watch, you've got the uprisings that happened last year in Gauteng and in KZN, and there's no intelligence capacity because he never showed the political leadership to be able to turn around the NPA, the Hawks, the SEPs, crime intelligence, and that's quite apart from the economic clusters. That is a disaster. For President Cyril Ramaphosa, becoming president was a bucket list item, but he's actually been at best mediocre, and at worst he's been implicated first as deputy president, saying nothing, while a lot of state capture happened under his watch, and then as president he hasn't shown definitive leadership. Even in this moment is undecided. Now the reason why I am summarizing that is just to remind the person that has been living on another planet, or who is so caught in the grip of Ramaphosa leftover sentiment, that when we talk about short-term pain, you and I, we mustn't pretend as if 2 days ago South Africa was a stable country. We've had the politicization of the criminal justice system, at best technical incompetence. We've got assassinations inside the SEPs. We've got the cliffing of good career cops, whether it be IPID, the head of crime intelligence, our country's most important expert on gangs have been conveniently sidelined, Jeremy Veery. And so you can stack up the details of leadership incompetence under Cyril Ramaphosa. And so when someone says, well, you know what, money was just stolen from the guy's farm, let's not be disproportionate in what we think the punishment ought to be for not even him doing something wrong, but something wrong that was done to him. That is empirically a false description of the presidency of Mr. Ramaphosa. And if someone were to write the Ramaphosa years and really do an analytical job of describing and then assessing what he was like as president, even before Arthur Fraser went to the SAPs, I think he comes out looking quite mediocre. And the reason I wanted to mention that is that when people do up this kind of weighing, oh my God, what would life be under Didi? Please be mindful of the fact that life under Ramaphosa is terrible.
Okay, let's end it. We're done. We're done. Like that is.
Because people romanticize it.
No,
He's the smiling president.
I've been waiting for someone to articulate that, because it feels like that view is so missing from the current moment, and maybe because we don't have time to talk about it. But even beyond the failures to uproot corruption, we haven't even gotten to governance and just service delivery. And can anyone look around and say there's been some massive upsurge in governmental delivery? If anything, it's probably gone backwards. Economic indicators, unemployment, inequality, poverty, racialized, gender-based violence. So beyond Ramaphosa's immediate presidential decisions, in terms of the state of, I haven't even mentioned the worst rolling blackouts in the history of the country, right? So, I mean, it actually, the premise actually does need to be questioned. Like, what what worse thing are we really talking about here? And I guess the answer to that question would be there's going to be looting, quote unquote. There's going to be this new state capture, right? And I think that's true. I mean, I think there's a danger of that. I have two responses, and then we'll open it back up to you. Number one, let's look at corruption again. Has it magically disappeared? Have senior ANC leaders implicated in corruption? Which leaders that are not currently in power will be in power?
Yeah.
Mabuza's already deputy president. So,
absolutely.
So you're fine with him being deputy but not president?
Yeah. Yeah, precisely.
So tell us exactly what kind of different corruption on a different scale we will see.
Yeah.
That is better than what we have now. And then also tell us exactly how service delivery or economic indicators would be much worse. Maybe there is a case, but I'm not sure. People have just created fear and said there's going to be this terrible.
Yeah.
What is the specific content of that terrible future without the president?
I think that's very important, and I don't want to put it in those terms, but I think you're right to go there. Which is to ask as one would normally do colloquially, how much worse can it get? Question. Now, sure, it can get much more worse, but it is important to be sober in not doing the opposite error, which is to say, forget to accurately describe the status quo. And the status quo is horrible in its detail. I'm embarrassed as a political animal when I read Jacques Poe's book, because even though I know how structurally unjust our country is, you kind of forget to remember the minutiae until someone who's a details person more than a big pictures person says to you, let me drag you back down into the footnotes of the state capture report. And then you realize, actually, this is worse than you think it is. So the average person who is irate would call into a talk radio station today and bemoan, for example, the lack of job opportunities, the levels of gratuitous crime in our country in terms of the violence that accompanies it, both the crime and the gratuitous violence, that is, inequity and how that correlates with gratuitous violence. And we can rattle off all of those things. And yet things are far worse than that. And the question is no longer, is South Africa a society in which corruption is rife? Have we downgraded from state capture back to mere corruption, which is, I think, on an analytical level, what people probably imagine Zuma versus Ramaphosa is about. They might concede some of the things we're talking about in our description of the status quo and say, but the worst than Eusebius, this current situation, would be to go back to full-scale state capture. There's problems in the status quo, but now we have garden variety corruption, maybe a little bit of indecision around getting rid of people that he shouldn't have kept on, but we don't have state capture in the way in which state capture had been theorized, as this grand project of repurposing the state in order to benefit from corruption into perpetuity. That kind of thing no longer happens. Actually, I would challenge someone who holds that optimistic view about the status quo and say that if anything, and a couple of columnists have raised this, but it hasn't really gone viral, the question to be asked is, are we morphing into a gangster state that is similar to some countries in, for example, South America?
I think one of the interesting things about your public voice, and it's quite rare, funnily enough, is there aren't a lot of people who have called for Zuma's resignation and Ramaphosa's resignation. There are those who've called rightly, in my view. And I want to make this clear, because the minute you start criticizing the president, people say that you're trying to defend the Zuma era or you're pursuing David Mabuza's agenda. I think you and I have been very clear about the disastrous Zuma tenure, and we both called for his resignation. So there are people who didn't call for Zuma's resignation who are now calling for Ramaphosa's resignation, which is also disingenuous. They were willing to overlook the Nkandla Constitutional Court judgment. They were willing to overlook an infinity of errors, and suddenly are now prepared to pounce on Ramaphosa. But the fact of the matter is that our position is the right one, isn't it? It's that both of them have done things which require their resignation, and it's completely inconsistent to require one to resign and not the other, whichever that one is.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the only thing one can debate, and I don't know how much time we want to spend on this question, is of course the reality that our leadership choices in terms of the pipeline are horrible because we have not yet had an excellent leader as head of state. They've all been flawed in all sorts of ways, and I think we should have a full-fledged public debate around the question, given inherent human fallibility, what is the best we can hope for and what are we looking for? If you look at everyone who's nominated to potentially be on the NEC of the ANC, for example, or if you look inside the EFF or inside the DA, what does talent mean in the context of imperfection? Because you're not going to get someone who comes along, which is what a lot of people assumed after NASRAC 2017, as it might be a little bit boring, maybe the odd searing speech now and then if we're lucky, but he's going to be the president who's going to be the technocrat and really turn around the state of the state. Yeah. And it's turned out that he's not the technocrat, that he's actually been allowing himself to be a continuation of the previous guy. So I do think consistency is important, and where I sometimes self-examine, but maybe I haven't spent enough time ruminating on this, is in terms of ideal theory. If we were consistently applying these norms of what's acceptable behavior, I wonder whether we will get a president that will complete a term without at some point falling foul of these norms. And so I haven't settled it for myself. But in some of my debates, the reason I'm pushing that viewpoint anyway is that I think what we should guard against is setting our standards too low. And our expectations too low, even below the normative vision of the Constitution. And in addition to setting our standards too low, the other thing we need to guard against is being fatalistic and say, oh well, it's just the way things are. It's a fait accompli. We are destined to have these horrible people. And someone said to me on Facebook yesterday, you keep talking about ethics and ethical norms and standards. It's not going to happen, dude. It's like water and oil when it comes to politics. And I said to him, this is exactly the kind of thing that plays into the hands of the thugs. They love it when we give up on demanding ethical decency in our politics. And so there's part of me that thinks if your bar is this high, you will be perpetually putting people on trial for potential impeachment. And then there's another part of me that thinks you've got to push back against even the reasonable disenchantment of the average Joe by reminding them there's nothing that a criminal likes more than you giving up on them being held accountable, and then they can just steal into perpetuity.
That's, I think continuing on this theme of what would happen if Ramaphosa resigns, right? And we've so far been quite generous in saying to maybe the other side of that argument, okay, there will be some drawbacks, right? Let me come with a different perspective, right? What if it's better, right? And for the following reason. One of my main problems with the Ramaphosa presidency doesn't necessarily relate so much to Ramaphosa and his misconduct, but it's the role he plays in insulating the ANC government from true scrutiny and accountability.
Yes.
So his position as media darling,
yes,
which is fast vanishing, but that position of assumed credibility shields the ANC from the real scrutiny that it deserves.
Absolutely.
And so when that veneer of credibility is finally removed, then we get to see the ANC for what it really is. And is this living in willful ignorance when the country is crumbling better than actually reckoning with the true state of the ANC?
I think that's a very important position to posit. I had this discussion last night with with a very good friend of mine who's also a broadcaster, and she said, you know what, I don't know how I feel about this, Eusebius. I'm in so many different spaces, because quite frankly, it's not that I think Ramaphosa is perfect or anything, but if I'm honest with myself, I get far more annoyed by Julius Malema or by John Steenhuisen than this guy. And so on the one hand, there's that part of me that kind of doesn't want to see him fall. And then there's another part of me, she says, which is to your point, that thinks what might be great about him being cliffed or cliffing himself is that it will hasten the demise of the ANC. And then she says, which I do want to see. Right? So that might be a good thing for the country. So we get out of the one party dominance and this idea that but for the ANC, the country is going to implode, as if the ANC has delivered a better life for all, which it never did. And it pretends that it's doing so, and that it can renew itself. So there is the possibility that we get on with what we, at a psychopolitical level, don't allow ourselves to do, which is to take a chance on both imagining and going from imagining to actually taking the steps to realizing life without the ANC. But to put it even more bluntly, and this is another conversation I had with a friend of mine, Mr. Ramaphosa has been, in the imagination of especially white people, a sort of Mandela 2.0. And so part of his likability, including for black people, but for different constituencies, the likability comes in all sorts of ways. You know, for some, not all, some black middle class people, he sounds like one of us. You know, he can be in this conversation, dulcet tones. We don't have to worry about whether he will know to use the cutlery from inside back in when he sits next to Charles, because he's one of us. Whereas there's a kind of like, as Tsholanang said, a kind of aesthetic revulsion the middle classes have towards President Jacob Zuma, right? So there's that likability. And then for many white South Africans who hark back to the 90s and we just managed to avert civil war moment, and we're so grateful. Of course, the image of Rolf Meyer and Mandela 2.0 is stuck on their brains. And that stops us from being completely clinical and unromantic in beginning the process of imagining life without the ANC, so that we can actually take it seriously as a near future rather than as a distant future possibility. And if he was out of the way, we need to trust ourselves. In a sense, the fear is an unnecessary degree of not trusting ourselves as a collective. As if we need the ANC, even though it would evidence that the ANC is not useful to us collectively. But if he's out of the way, what you are talking about at a psychopolitical level may be very important. And I dare say, I mean, this is me trying to be nice to ANC people that are, their bloods would be boiling as they watch this part of our conversation.
Well, that's
but I mean, that's going to happen anyway. You know, I'm sure the comment sections are hot. But I dare say it will even grant the possibility for the ANC to more seriously think about redirecting itself, because it will only do so when it no longer feels that it is guaranteed political power.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I'm so enjoying finally having the opportunity to actually think through this and talk through this. And just finally, because I want to come to the report, because I think you've got interesting things to say about the report itself, what it means in this moment. So that'll be the next kind of set of questions we delve into. But finally, on this question of the president's resignation, whether it's wise, whether it's unwise, whether it will implode the country or not, and whether he should resign or not. There's a certain powerlessness as well, which I think picks up on your previous point in the discourse about if Ramaphosa goes and we are suddenly subject to some parasitic faction of the ANC, which assumes that we can do nothing, that we wouldn't stand up, we wouldn't protest, we wouldn't use legal avenues, that finally journalism would actually get more serious about holding presidential power accountable again. So this idea that, well, we're just at the whim of the ANC, I think also undervalues and undermines the public's ability to cry out. Let's say David Mabuza takes over tomorrow and does something obviously corrupt or appoints someone obviously wrong. We have the power to stand up, to challenge that, And so this idea that we as a South African citizenry are just going to be beholden totally to whoever takes over is also needs, I think, to be questioned.
Yeah, and I want to say two things to that. I want to come back to a concept that I landed but didn't unpack earlier. Without being too theoretical, when I say the possibility of a gangster state should be taken seriously, the political scientists who are watching will be able to do a better job than me at putting bones to the theoretical elements of the conversation. The idea of a democratic state morphing into a corrupt state, morphing into a state that has been captured, morphing into a gangster state. Those are very different degrees of harm in terms of what the state looks like and what it does to the citizens of that society. And in a gangster state, in particular, there are certain red flags where you now realize not only do you get the service provider inflating an invoice, which would be corruption, or state capture, where I'm grooming the CEO of Telkom and falsely pretending that it needs a fundamental overhaul that is worse than corruption. I'm repurposing the entire edifice.
Sure.
In a gangster state, we get different kinds of things. Organized criminality that is just on fleek. Your child suddenly being stolen on their way to school and someone wanting ransom for it. Suddenly having crime intelligence within the SAPs being used to spy on citizens and factions of the party. And you think of, in the imagination, even though stereotyping of sort of the political class, you might think of a society like, say, Colombia, and you literally have gangsterism as you have in the Cape Flats, scaled up on a different level within different parts of the state and in our communities. And when you have, for example, in the SAPs, someone that is able to make sure that guns are stolen and then sold on to gangs across the country, then you begin to show the elements of a gangster state and worse. And we can put more put more flesh to the bones on that concept. And the reason I'm saying that is because when we talk about us being scared of how the country might implode without the ANC and without Ramaphosa's ANC, we don't realize how much of our worst fears are beginning to play out under the status quo. It's just that some of the journalists who do excellent work on this, like Karen, for example, what's her name, surname now, she'll forgive me, who's written books about, for example, Long Street in Cape Town, where you and I go as revelers. Matrix are about to go and have their parties there, and the bouncers are not just scary folks keeping you out. There's connections between what happens in Paulsmoor, forcing the owners of those clubs to pay money. If they don't, then you scare them because you might have all sorts of, sort of keep killing and scaring them and intimidating them to pay for money because that's your turf. And a lot of those clubs become places through which drug cartels are able to get drugs that come from other parts of the world to the final consumer, that may be young people or who are out there, sort of just doing their thing. And the point that I'm trying to make is that beneath the surface of everyday South African life, there is an undergird that is very unstable and that exhibits elements of what you would find in countries that we typically think we could never become. Forget Zim. We're now talking about certain, I'm not saying all, certain features of, let's say, Somalia, or certain features of Colombia and other parts of South America and Central America. That's already in the status quo.
Honduras
so when
comes to mind.
Absolutely, yeah. So when we say, be careful what you wish for, Eusebius, it's better to know to be with the scoundrel that you know than the ones that you don't know. Didi is not doing much at the moment, and is not the president. And those structural elements and the sliding away from state capture towards a gangster state is happening under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa. And so the country needs to really reckon with their fears, because your worst fears are actually playing out currently, but it's not being mainstreamed. And unless you know the work of a reporter or investigative reporter who's very humble and doesn't center themselves on social media, or the editors don't put their work on the front page because we put political personalities on the front page, but you've got to go to page 7 to really understand, let's say, for example, the links between Pollsmoor and gangsterism in Aldos and what might happen in clubs in Melville. You don't see those connections because we also make strange editorial decisions about what to center. But those aspects of life in South Africa is pretty scary, and it's part of our reality already. Now, just to end it by then reflecting on what are the implications for trusting ourselves. Firstly, it can't get too much worse if you know the full truth of what's happening currently. And I think many people don't, including the ones who think that they moan too much. Even people who think they moan too much actually don't realize how many more reasons empirically they have to moan much more than they are. But then secondly, as you say, just as black South Africans, to take a optimistic, positive example, were able to form street committees to fight the Nats in the 80s, and then turn them also into scaffolding each other positively with black consciousness. I think of places like King is London, where you've got clinics that support each other, and you take the same structures that are anti-apartheid structures that are meant to help the liberation movements to fight the Nats, but you can also simultaneously use them as a form of self-affirmation and making sure that in those communities you are scaffolding each other materially, you're looking after each other, you create clinics and that kind of thing. In other words, we were resourceful and thriving, not quite thriving, but we were resourceful under conditions of that extremity. And so we've got to remind ourselves of our capacity to survive and to keep our humanity intact despite apartheid conditions. And as much as I can diss the ANC for hours, we're not literally the apartheid state. There's elements of continuity, as your book explores, but we're not quite literally the apartheid state. And so we really should trust ourselves to have the collective capacity to survive any ANC, whether it's a DD ANC or a Ramaphosa ANC.
And on that, I keep wanting to go to the report, but then you keep saying interesting.
We should go to the report because I think some people are trivializing the report.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in a sense, I've loved the conversation so far. I think it's a full meal. But in a sense, we are taking for granted that many people watching, I guess, understand how serious the report is. But in case there's a skeptic or a super fan of the president's, we probably should at some point rehearse why the report is important despite the label preliminary.
Definitely. The interesting thing you said before we get to the report, this episode is going to be called Before We Get to the Report. This idea again that there's going to be some massive implosion. State capture takes time too. Even at the height of the worst interpretation of state capture, you would say that really came in at least the second term of President Zuma, right? So you don't just wake up one day and capture the state, right? And we've got an election that's 20 months away. I'm not even convinced that it would be possible to truly, fully capture the state in a worse way than we've already seen in 20 months, when the ANC has a lower parliamentary majority than they had then. So once again, just like this idea that there's going to be an imminent crisis. Well, so how exactly are you going to, you have to appoint thousands of people to do that. And it's not clear to me that that's even possible.
I think that's right. And I think that's it's important to be that commonsensical about it. The only way you can do it is to be quite literally brazen. The kind of brazenness that's the political equivalent of the July riots. But like you said, if it gets that brazen, then we will just have a popular uprising.
Exactly.
And I don't think it will get that brazen.
And so actually what we might see if Ramaphosa resigns is actually just continuity.
Yeah.
It'll be
And importantly, Sizwe, before we get to the report, if it doesn't resign, we're going to see the continuity anyway. And I hope, if nothing else, that the public wrestles in this conversation with, if he doesn't resign, can we unknow what we now know about how truly bad the status quo is? Because that's also important.
Yeah.
So even if he doesn't resign and is persuaded to stay on, I hope people have a deeper understanding of the malaise than before. Previously, we would have said gangsterism is a problem, high unemployment is a problem. In general, house invasions are horrible, rape volume is horrible. All of those things on their own are horrible features of our society.
Yeah.
But the other little things are not so little, like organized crime and features of a gangster state. Lindiwe Mazibuko asked a good question around that in a Sunday Times column a couple of weeks ago. And even one or two ANC cadres, because they typically find their backbone when they're no longer in government, have written around this. What are the elements of a society that is sliding from a democratic state into one that is becoming fascistic? And then you can also say, what are the red flags? Because it's not like someone comes along and says, let me hit this button, from tomorrow you're going to be Zim 2000. You've got to look out for red flags. And even ANC elders who are no longer interested in governance suddenly realize that those red flags are many. Yeah. And so if the president has not resigned, this is not an episode about his post-mortem. It's still important to ask yourself, as a Democrat, how do I feel about a country that has got these obvious elements that I know, but also these other features that have now been brought to my attention? And what will that do to me from a political point of view as I think about my vote in 2024?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's get to the report. And, we've both read the report. And again, I've been looking for someone to really delve into this report, because I think there's so much, both about what this report represents for our country's history, legally and politically. And I guess one interesting place to start would be contextualizing the aim of this report. I think one of the big debates that has arisen is, to what extent do these findings confirm liability or guilt? To what extent do words like may actually give the president wiggle room? To what extent does a prima facie or on the face of it finding actually water down a finding? And I think let's start there, because there's a lot to be said about what this report actually is and isn't.
As a commentator, I sometimes have my most fun conversations, other than with someone like you domestically, with foreign correspondents, because when you explain South Africa to an international audience, you are compelled to be a little bit more systematic and to be clearer in a way in which you sometimes skim over on South African TV, because you make assumptions about shared understanding and knowledge. And yet you then end up seeing people disagreeing in all sorts of unnecessary ways, verbal disagreements that shouldn't be real disagreements, just because we haven't done the basics around definitions, for example. And as I said to you off air, I had a wonderful conversation with an American journalist last night, and she asked me such basic questions that I thought, this is such great prep for my own work over the next few days, including this conversation, because it kind of forces you to take 2-3 steps back, because you now need to describe the basics before you get to the report to an American audience, for example, or British audience. There's a 3-step process by which a president can be successfully impeached. The reason why the possibility of impeachment exists, which you also explained very well in your Mail and Guardian article, is that the president is gifted with enormous constitutional power, and rightly so. We don't have a presidential system like in the USA, but we do have a system that allows the president, for example, to make appointments as an executive authority about who constitutes his cabinet, who the DGs are, and those in turn are positions with enormous powers as well, adjacent to his powers, that affect policy making and implementation and ultimately the quality of lives of millions of citizens. And we recognize, for better or worse, or not recognize, we have a notion the world over that you need a leader. And we don't have flat structures in political systems the world over. But what we try to do is to say, because human beings are fallible, what will we do if Mandela suddenly became a dictator? And so we design accountability mechanisms so that the enormous power we give you to have the freedom to enact your vision that you had successfully sold on your way to victory in the elections, so that we can rein you in if you have a bad day at the office or if you become a person we never knew you would become. And there are many accountability mechanisms. Most famously, South Africans will go to Chapter 9 of the Constitution, which have a bunch of extra parliamentary or non-parliamentary mechanisms to ensure accountability. In other words, holding those who exercise public power accountable for how they do so. The public protector has become the most famous one, but there are others in that chapter. And then you have other kinds of accountability. The judiciary acts as accountability, Parliament acts as an important oversight of the government, and of course commentators, the media and the public at large. And I suppose at the most basic level, the vote itself is a form of accountability. But impeachment says you can't wait necessarily 5 years before getting rid of someone who is guilty of serious misconduct or is no longer capable of being president, or who has trampled and seriously violated certain statutes, including the Constitution as the most important basic law of the country. And then it designs a process to test whether such a violation has happened, where there's an allegation as such. And what we don't want is a president to be spuriously called to Parliament to come and account for something they have not done wrong. And so with a little bit of case law, we try and figure out the meaning of the Constitution and we build on it. And to oversimplify, but not too much, the way the independent panel comes about is that its point is to help Parliament to not waste time. So it exists to say to Parliament, go ahead and have a full-fledged process where you set up a committee that has got enormous power, including public hearings if it so feels it needs. It can ask for submissions, it can hear oral testimony, and really in a very rigorous manner test the veracity of claims about a president allegedly having committed a serious misconduct or some kind of offense that goes against the Constitution or other sources of law. And so it is not an unimportant and trivial part of the three-step process. The third part would be then voting on what the parliamentary impeachment committee had done. But this first step is to make sure that you don't have nonsense going to Parliament. But it's limited because they don't call witnesses by way of example. If they don't have all the submissions of documents that could have helped them to analyze the text before them most fully and most rigorously, that's a limitation too. But here's the danger, Sizwe, and I'll pause after this. Just because that is step one, and it plays a kind of filtering role to make sure that we don't waste time with a full-fledged committee if there isn't a case to answer, doesn't mean that its findings should be regarded as not significant and not the basis for potential ethical and political consequences already.
Yeah.
In the same way in which we say, I've watched 9 hours of live TV of the State Capture Commission. I don't need to wait for them to write up the reports or the NPA to have a charge sheet ready that it can now take to court to try and find this person or that person guilty of a crime. I've made up my mind as an intelligent citizen. What I've heard here is enough for me to make a judgment call about this person's bona fides, their integrity, etc. And that's legit. It doesn't mean that you're engaging in something that's anti-intellectual. It doesn't mean that you've lowered the bar. Criminal law standards exist for all sorts of reasons that you and I can philosophically talk about that are important. But if there's a common sense set of judgments that I can make based on what is here, then you don't need step 2 before you can make up your mind. Then, in fact, in some circumstances, I would say you're being lazy and you are being irresponsible to not see things plainly if they are plain after 5 minutes of interrogating you. And what this committee has said is, we don't make definitive factual findings because we don't have the same enormous, more expansive powers that a parliamentary committee would have. But then, Justice Ngobo says, my goodness, based on just what we have, he's got a case to answer. We don't know how this money came in. It seriously looks as if this wasn't a genuine business transaction. And on his own version, and you know, with many lawyers in your life and that you know, and your own interest in the law, there's nothing worse for the other side than when a sentence starts off with the words, on the other side's own version, they're in trouble.
Yeah.
You know, the same in competitive debating. On the version of the president that he has now given. Because the other beautiful thing about step 1 is that for the first time, we know the president's version, because until now he's been mum. And on his own version, he acknowledges the theft happened, because remember, some of us didn't believe Arthur. The president could have denied theft happened, but now he concedes it, and we almost forget how significant it is that he has officially agreed that it happened. But as soon as he agrees that it happened and he says that it happened, which he does, then immediately it raises questions such as, why didn't you report it immediately?
Why didn't you tell the nation about it?
Why didn't you tell the nation about it?
Then,
right, as a matter of transparency.
Yeah.
And then suddenly other questions raise themselves. The dude is a businessman, but he told us that he's not a businessman. And he told us about a blind trust. And okay, if there's a close cooperation, what in business law, it turns out that he's the only person there anyway, so you must be operationally involved. And on his version, this person that I think will take the fall, that is one of the 2 managers, there's the one guy with a weird English name, and then there's a black dude involved. They had a conversation. The first thing I find weird, by the way, is the idea that a safe is not safe, and that a couch is more safe than a safe. Like that is just weird.
Okay.
So like, the case, you know, so it's almost it's one of those cases where you go, okay, I've heard enough. You know, this is over. We are casting you for the role. Or one of those cases, I've heard enough. This guy's guilty. We don't need to continue with the trial. So we can go through the rest of the process, but you've got to be really disingenuous as a super Ramaphosa fan to pretend that only until step 2 is done are we allowed to have an opinion.
No, absolutely. And I want to actually go into each of those things you've spoken about, because each of them is fascinating in its own right. I want to start with this idea of the standard for whether something is definitive versus the standard of whether something is persuasive, and put that up against the standard of presidential conduct and what the minimum standard of presidential conduct is.
Sure.
Because there are 2 questions for me as we untangle this, right? There's whether something is conclusive proof for something, like criminal liability. But the standard for presidential conduct is not criminal. For the standard for presidential credibility is lower than criminality.
Yes.
Right? So there's an interesting interplay here. On the one hand, a standard of proof, but on the other hand, a standard of credibility. And people are disagreeing on both of those things, right? So for me, there's the standard in this panel is really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, it's not just like the NPA saying we think there's a case here, right? Because that could be a case for anything.
Yeah.
We think there's a case for a trivial theft of a sweet from a supermarket, right? The standard is, it's not conclusive, but it's serious.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of double thing happening there where on the one hand, it's not definitive, but on the other hand, it has to be a serious thing.
Yeah.
So when you say, I think there may be something serious, you're actually saying more than just, I think there may be something there. You're saying, I think there may be something there that's actually impeachable.
That is so crucial. That is so crucial.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when people do not read every single word in a sentence, or cherry pick the part of the sentence that is useful to them.
Absolutely.
They did not say, we think there's possible wrong.
Yeah.
They're clear that there's wrong.
Yeah.
They think there's possibly something seriously wrong. Because remember, they want to be helpful to Parliament. And Parliament doesn't want to know whether you think there's something wrong. They want to know whether you think there's something seriously wrong, because that's the language relevant for potential impeachment.
Yeah.
But I want to add something else, and I see whether I can explain it without losing the public. When we say you don't need criminal law standards, some people might think you guys are deliberately trying to lower the bar for wrongdoing because you are anti-Ramaphosa. Let's say people think that. Actually, what we are saying, I think we're both saying this, is that on some issues we actually want a higher bar than the legal bar.
Exactly.
The bar for credibility, which is a political judgment, I think should actually be higher than legal standards.
Definitely.
So I'm not saying throw away legal standards and let's find someone guilty quickly. I'm actually saying sometimes the law doesn't even give us high enough standards. Because even if the president were to be not guilty on criminal law standards on some of the claims made about him, there are some things that he will never be able to overcome in terms of political credibility. For example, why did you not take the nation into account, into your confidence? Why did you mislead Parliament by pretending you're not involved in a business? And when you talk about a blind trust, we reasonably assume that your full-time job and your only job from now until you leave government is to be head of state. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, you're busy with
literally back at the ranch.
Back at the ranch, quite literally, right? And there, I'm not interested in legal questions. And this is where LLB Twitter will tie itself in all sorts of unnecessary knots. There are non-legal questions that are very serious, and even if they don't go to the legal standards for impeachment, should still potentially be the demise of this guy, in the same way in which you may get into legal trouble for violating COVID laws that you have enacted as Boris Johnson. But let's imagine it wasn't against regulations to have a party. We might decide, as a matter of political culture, hypocrisy of that kind is a good enough reason to demand you to resign. How the hell can you have a party when I can't go to the funeral of my aunt? When that question was put to Boris Johnson, it wasn't framed in legalistic terms, even though there was some interest in will the police or not see this as something that's worthy of a fine. There was a legal element to it. But the fundamental national conversation in the UK was, you darn hypocrite. And the notion of political hypocrisy there is a non-legal notion. So I really hope that, even though you're right, we can stay with these different aspects. We'll come back to more of them. That is legalistic. I'm always simultaneously, as a political animal, interested in very important non-legal questions. And I think the president understands that, funny enough. I think part of his shame that he's busy internalizing and dealing with right now is because he knows that regardless the minutiae around the legal stuff, which is interesting and important, his political credibility, quite apart from his ethical stance, have been massively found wanting and dented.
And it seems that there are two streams of conduct that are under the microscope. Right? So there's whether he acted in violation of the Constitution, and then there's whether there was criminal misconduct or some breach of criminal laws. And one of the things, again, that I don't think people have appreciated is that the panel could have come back and said, well, we think constitutionally he's violated in a potentially serious way, but on this criminal law stuff, we're reaching. Or they could have said, there seem to be criminal breaches, but quite frankly, constitutionally, there's no serious violation. Instead, the panel, and we're not talking about first-year law students here, or even people who have had their LLBs. We're talking about a former Chief Justice, a judge and a senior advocate, who look at the conduct, who look at the president's version and say, not only is there a potential serious violation of the Constitution, there's also a potential serious violation of criminal law. So both of those things are now at play, and either one of them is potentially irredeemable.
And I want to connect it to what I was saying about organized crime and morphing towards a gangster state.
So true, actually.
One of the things that is causing, ironically enough, under the status quo, not under DD's leadership, under Mr. Ramaphosa's leadership, that is causing us a massive headache at the moment, are perceptions that South Africa has got porous digital borders, and it's a wonderful place through which you can flow illicit money. And the questions are then asked, what's happened to our ability in terms of the various regulatory structures that we have in place to be able to get back to a country that has a reputation for excellent oversight in terms of financial institutions being able to monitor money that come in and out of the country, and to be able to nip in the bud people who think that we are an easy and a safe haven for criminality when it comes to economic crimes and organized criminality in particular. In turn, you answer that question by asking yourself, how effective are laws such as a statute that is designed to combat and to prevent that kind of economic crime?
Sure.
And if the president can't account, and here we've got to be agnostic rather than definitive,
Sure.
but it has not yet accounted factually where this money came from and how it came into the country, why it wasn't reported to SARS. If it wasn't reported, why didn't you bank it? Why did you stuff it into the couch? This is exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to prevent happening on a large scale. And we're beginning to gain a reputation internationally for apparently not being able to nip this kind of thing in the bud. And then your president becomes Exhibit A.
Can I also just, on some of the factual things which you've alluded to, right? And one thing that you said that's really important that, again, I think people need to appreciate is that it may be true that the independent panel has not come to a definite, and is not designed to come to a definitive finding.
Yeah.
But on some of these claims, one would have thought it would be really easy to rebut or refute a claim.
Or to fill out a missing link.
Exactly.
Why is this question not answered, Sizwe?
Yeah.
By him voluntarily
Yeah.
in his submission? How did the money come into the country?
Exactly. That's so, you don't need to have a criminal trial or of witnesses or anything to just say, this is how it came into the country. Here's the record, and it was for a completely innocent purpose. What a funny situation we're in.
Yes.
When you can't convince people about basic factual questions, then it's not, you're not rushing if you start having even deeper doubts about what's going on here.
Absolutely.
Right? Because,
absolutely.
And for me, everything is just eye-popping in this report. And the report left aside so many things. It left aside tax things. It left aside a lot of Reserve Bank things, which in themselves could be interesting. But when these independent panelists can't even verify, and the president couldn't even convince them that there actually was a game sale here, and he couldn't show that this is for buffaloes, and these buffaloes are still at the farm. Why haven't they?
And why haven't they left?
Then
unless it was buffaloes, herbs, and spices.
Exactly. Then you start wondering, hold on a second, what if this money did, and it's legitimate. In fact, the panel says we have substantial doubts that there was then wait, where did the money come from? And then you start thinking, well, we know that African leaders are often, when they resign or when they're ousted from office, you find these dollars in their homes, and that the trade in cash, is one way of just bribery.
Yeah.
And then you start wondering, well, why was it in the sofa? And so actually the real question starts to emerge. Is there something here that is not even just a mistake, but that is actually deeply.
So I want to say two things about that. That I think is really important. And yeah, I disagree a little bit with Pierre, who I otherwise constantly defend against his own trolls, because I think he does an excellent job as an academic lawyer. The panel goes through at the start the possibility that sometimes we can fall foul of the law accidentally.
Yeah.
And they then wrestle with the question, and they reference here, even though it was in a minority report, some very useful analysis from former Chief Justice Mogoeng on the question of what is bad faith. A bad faith error. And then they give examples, and they say, well, if you are my legal advisor and I'm president, and you always give me advice that's pretty sound, and you say, you can get this money, just it's okay, keep it at home. You can violate the law, but not in bad faith.
Sure.
But on the other hand, if I pick up the phone and I say, Sizwe, as DG, please get rid of Eusebius. I want you to make sure that the MC that you hire for the next event is actually my cousin.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a clear abuse of power, because my intention there is obviously to get you to do something wrong. In other words, if you look at the facts of each particular case, you can sometimes infer quite reasonably, without trying to be too clever, sometimes through common sense and sometimes with a little bit more complexity, whether or not, even where there's a violation, whether it's a good faith one or a bad faith one. And in this case, unless the president tells us more, but even the fact that he didn't tell us already doesn't help him, it doesn't seem as if we can fill out in a way that is generous and helps him the possibility that he couldn't have known, he didn't know, because the question then becomes, if it was supposed to be a good faith error that you did not make the tax authorities aware, you didn't go and bank it within the right amount of time, why do you go to such lengths to ask the Namibian authorities to please handle this with, quote, discretion, or to be discreet about it?
Yeah.
Why do you not tell the nation about it? Why is there such a huge time lag until the point where you ask Ruede to fly back to the country to come and deal with this? And what Pierre misses is that's not enough to comply with reporting to the SAPS, because when Ngobo listened more carefully, as a good jurist does, you basically tell the guy to come back to you, right? Which means that you are trying to control what happens to that investigation.
Sure.
And the point that I'm trying to make is that we can reasonably infer that there's mischief going on here with this money situation, because there are way too many improbabilities to arrive at the conclusion that any non-compliance with technical sources of law that none of us are familiar with, including the president, was just good faith non-compliance. I think it is unlikely. And I think the real truth about the money would probably be a massive embarrassment to the president and or the ANC. And I'll say no more than that. But I suspect that is the case. I suspect there's something there. And frankly, if you are a Ramaphosa fan, I blame your guy for Sizwe and I spending 3 minutes to puzzle through speculative political analysis, because not giving a frank version that fills out all of these questions factually makes you susceptible to exactly this kind of hypothesizing.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of this anecdote in, ironically, President Obama's presidential memoir. And he speaks about how he gets to Saudi Arabia and they have these meetings and bilateral conversations, and they go back to their hotel rooms, and laid out on a table are Rolexes and diamond necklaces and various rare, extremely rich and valuable items, right, that are just casually left there. and he thinks to himself, well, he knows, and he laughs. He's like, obviously, firstly, this would be found if we took it, but secondly, it's against policy to take these things. But does every government not take these things? And it just makes me worry and wonder, like, we have no idea what happens in the way that these things are exchanged between governments when trips to the Middle East are planned, or and cash is the way it happens. And so I'm not saying that I know or I have proof or that there's evidence, let alone incontrovertible evidence. But the way the president is acting has not in any way been able to persuade me that there isn't some strange source of or origin. And,
Sizwe, let's overlay that with domestic examples. Forget about the even the, sort of nefarious politicians helping each other out across borders. Rapoo reminds us, I might get the numbers wrong of the example, but let's go back to 2017. You'll remember the spurious claim that some of the spooks were making. We're going to be in trouble. It seems as if there's some foreign spies coming to Nasrec, and we can't guarantee the safety of government ministers that will be in and out of the place. We need a new piece of equipment, and we need it quickly, like a grabber or something of that sort. And they then, because it's quick, you also then suddenly, and they love to pretend that there's an emergency that's imminent, because then you also flout regulations like the PFMA and other legislations around good governance and making sure that you get at least 3 quotes, etc. It's a competitive bid. And firstly, they were lying. There was no real threat. The apparent threat was just a couple of tourists who were backpacking nearby, and they knew that. And secondly, whichever the civil servant was that was leading this spurious attempt to buy the grabber, then also in their haste to get it said, well, we've got to buy it from this service provider, who actually had been banned from doing business with government because they'd previously done crappy business with government. And not only was the grabber something that no one could actually work with in intelligence, no one had the skill to be able to use it. So even if you wanted to use it as a device to help secure Nasrec, the skill set wasn't there. It's like us getting a piece of equipment and we can't plug it into the wall because it's not compatible. But to make it worse, Sizwe, it also turned out, if you do a quick Google search, that the most high-end part of this equipment goes for something like about 5 million rand. But lo and behold, under this emergency transaction from this dodgy supplier that had previously been blacklisted, they invoiced for about 45 million or thereabouts, right? And nothing ever came of that. That happens in South African politics all the time. Now, what do you think actually happens? Now, here is a little bit speculative, but it's typical. There are many examples, even going back to Mangaladzi, where ANC leeches from the public purse for internal ANC factional battles leading up to elective conferences. Those kinds of money, as sources of money, go to buy votes from delegates, for example. And the ANC is aware of the nexus between money and elective conferences inside the ANC. And the idea that elective conferences are honest representations of what branches feel, and that these representatives go to Jozi to go and simply represent the preferences of some ward in Makhanda, that's absolute BS. But the way you persuade them is no longer just by giving them KFC and giving them a t-shirt. You might also, or airtime and data, you might also give them some cash. So they need to get cash somewhere. President Ramaphosa, and I'm not trying to come up with a conspiracy, but President Ramaphosa, one of the things for him that might be a bad outcome, one of the many aspects of the bad outcome, is that we might come to a pithy conclusion in the medium term that it turned out he was just another ANC president. And part of what it means to be just another ANC politician is that you are mired in the connections between dirty money and internal ANC electioneering and careerism. And I think the question of where the money comes from and what its purpose was are the two most important questions in this query. And he's got a perverse incentive to resign, which is if you resign, you can also try and blunt an examination of those questions. A resignation, you and I discussed earlier, could be an act of honor to try and salvage yourself from the damning, on the face of it, findings of wrongdoing. But it might also be a tactical, selfish point to the resigning act, which is to try and blunt the kind of chachrak questions that we've just framed. Because if it should turn out in one not improbable scenario that this money is yet another example that could be a chapter in a book about connections between dirty money and ANC electioneering, imagine what that does to the idea of him as Mandela 2.0.
Eusebius, you've been very kind with your time. I'm going to ask one final question, lest we sit here and then he resigns and we don't even know and that's just to reflect on this moment in terms of its significance for our history and democracy as a whole. It's always hard to know from the present moment the significance of something. And often, when the Nkandla judgment came out, it wasn't actually clear at the time that this is going to be quite a watershed moment. But this feels significant, no matter what the president decides to do. Something about this moment is important. How would you reflect on that?
I think it's always difficult to speak into as well as to write into the moment. I think some people have a great skill doing that, by the way, on all sorts of issues, from politics to sport to everyday life and whatnot. So it is quite difficult, and I can't do that expansively, but maybe let me say two things that are just top of mind as you say that. One of the things you and I disagree with, and I will put it playfully and productively, I like our constitution a little bit more than you do. One of the things that's significant about this moment is that
I like it a lot right now.
is that it is constitutionalism in action. And that's important in the same way in which, as I wrote in a piece for Foreign Policy, one of the things I did like about the Concord judgment against the former president that led him to be incarcerated wasn't so much Schadenfreude that he's incarcerated, but where in the global north do you find a democracy that is that robust, that does not only pay lip service to the idea of constitutional supremacy and making sure that when we say parliamentary sovereignty is dead in 1994, that we don't sneak it in through the back door, right? So the idea of animating the constitution, which is the kind of language that is often used by Concord judges, we're often lyrical about that, but then it depends on how that actually plays out. And if you have non-compliance with the judgment, then you don't have true animation of the text. And I feel like what we're going through here is a beautiful illustration of the importance of animating the constitutional text. But what I would say secondly, at the risk of undermining that, but I'll behave like an academic and say it's a point in tension, not a contradiction, is I'm always reminded of the limitations of normative ideals, because the Constitution, as you know, and here you and I have overlap. You can't eat it. It doesn't help a woman to be safer. It doesn't deal with anti-black racism and white supremacy. It's an important text, but it is at best a vision of our best possible selves. But then there's a gap between that and reality. And I think this moment is important in a more dystopian way, because it reminds us of how the ANC has failed us, even when it has given us their best. Their best, in terms of singular leadership, was Mandela, Mbeki for certain parts of the ANC, those who thought aloofness is a deep political problem. President Zuma would have been also part of the best in the Polokwane moment. And of course, ultimately, the mentee of Mandela coming back via Bloemfontein to Pretoria and Cape Town as president. And yet, what this moment has shown us is that you've got to be very careful to assume that if someone is excellent at one point in time in political history, like being chief negotiator for that constitutional text, that it means you can also trust them to be the one to embody that text.
Eusebius, thanks so much for joining us on SMWX. We really appreciate your insights and time.
Cheers.
Ayeye, like, share, comment down below, and make sure you help us get to that 35,000 subscriber mark. See you on the next one.